I'm calling the order a special meeting of the City Council, Villa Hills, on the 17th day of March at 6 o'clock. I will give just some basic things, housekeeping issues, and then I'll turn the meeting over to Mrs. Jacobs, who will be the hearing officer, who will basically run the rest of the meeting, if you will. I respectfully ask everybody to make sure their cell phones are on vibrate, turn them off during this meeting. I would also, I guess that's the main thing I have to do. And then the other thing I would do is I would like to offer up to Chief Goodenough, as well as to his council, whether or not they want to have an open meeting or closed meeting.
We would like an open meeting.
Thank you. I just wanted to confirm it and make sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Jacobs, please.
Thank you, Mayor. My name is Patsy Jacobs, and I've been asked to be the hearing officer tonight. And my role will just be to preside at the hearing. Let me tell you a little bit about how it's going to proceed. We will get started in just a minute with the calling of witnesses. Each attorney will have the chance to ask the witnesses questions, and then we will offer the council a chance to answer or to ask any questions of the witnesses. Once we are concluded, the council will retire to deliberate and make findings of fact. I will not make any findings of fact. I'm just here to run the process of this. I will not make any decisions or judgments here today. I would ask that everyone go on and make sure your cell phones are off. We do need to have just people who are seated. We're not going to have any folks standing in here. So there is an overflow room behind us with the television, and everything is in the building behind us. So if you don't have a seat, I ask you to go on and proceed to the other building at this time. And that does include the hallway. Fire marshal issues, and so we've put in as many seats as we can, and there is an overflow room. We would also require that everyone maintain the dignity of the proceedings. If anyone is disruptive in any way, we'll ask you to leave the building. And with that being said,
No, just give a few minutes for people to go ahead and go to the next level.
I can't see the hallway. Are the folks out there?
They're leaving.
Okay.
Tommy, you can have this seat.
I'm going to go on and call the hearing to order. This is a matter of the disciplinary matter for Chief Goodenough. It's being called pursuant to special notice of the Villa Hills Council. Today is March 17, 2014, and the hearing is pursuant to 95-765, KRS 95-765. And ask the council to introduce themselves and who they represent, please.
Good evening. My name is Todd McMurtry. I'm the attorney for the City of Villa Hills.
Good evening. My name is Kelly Malloy-Myers. I'm the attorney for Dan Goodenough.
And my name is Randy Freaking. I'm also the attorney for Dan Goodenough.
Okay. Would either of the council like to have witnesses step outside while we proceed before they're called?
We would like separation of witnesses, except I think Chief Goodenough should be able to stay. And we anticipated Mayor Martin would be a witness, so we would like him excused.
I object. I don't think A, you can call the mayor as a witness. B, although I don't think he will deliberate with the council, he cannot be removed from the proceedings.
It's my understanding that he will not be called as a witness, so.
Well, he won't be called. He won't be called by the city as a witness, but we're going to call him as a witness. He's the one who's brought the charges against Chief Goodenough, and he should have the best first-hand knowledge of the charges against Chief Goodenough. He ought to be subject to cross-examination.
I don't agree. I think that there's competent authority in Kentucky that says that in this circumstance, since the mayor is sitting, although he won't be deliberating, he still reserves a tie-breaking vote. That as a member of the hearing board, that he is not properly to be a witness in this circumstance.
I'm going to let the mayor stay in during the proceedings. He will be a tie-breaking vote should the matter be tied with the council. I also believe that as a representative of the city and the complaining witness, he has the right to be here. If there are any other witnesses that are expected to be called in the room?
gonna call this Craig Bowman.
Call him first.
Yeah.
Folks, if you're in the hallway, you need to leave the building and go to the other room. If you don't have a seat, you need to go to the other building.
Yeah, we'll withdraw our request for separation of witnesses.
Do you want separation of witnesses? Can somebody tell me what's in the hallway there? I see folks standing back there. Sir, if you don't have a seat, you need to leave and go to the other building.
I'm a witness. Do you want me to stay or leave?
You won't be a witness.
Can't we get him a chair?
There's no more chairs, there's no more room. If you don't have a place to sit, you need to leave and go to the other building until you're
We'll
home.
give our chair up. Sir, would you like to come and sit, please?
Thank you very much.
I'm going across. Can I take it first? Sure. Come through.
Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is there anyone else in the hallway?
No, ma'am.
Thank you for answering. We are starting at 6 o'clock. I don't know how long we'll go, and this is for the benefit of council. If we get to be late into the evening, we may discuss at that point adjourning and reconvening at a later date, but we will cross that bridge when we get to it, okay? Would either side like to make an opening statement?
Prior to opening statement, there are 4 procedural issues that I'd like to bring before the hearing officer attention. The first is these charges should be before the Villa Hills Civil Service Commission, which was established by ordinance 2010-6. That ordinance requires that no employee in the classified service of the city shall be dismissed for any reason except inefficiency, misconduct, insubordination, or violation of law involving moral turpitude, or violation of any rule adopted by the City Council or Civil Service Commission. So any charges against an employee shall be communicated without delay to the Civil Service Commission of the city. Upon filing of those charges, the clerk of the Civil Service Commission shall notify its members and serve a copy of the charges upon the accused employee with a statement of the time of the hearing before the Civil Service Commission. The Chief of Police is specifically designated as subject to the Civil Service Commission by Villa Hills Ordinance. By letter dated March 13, 2014, the city attorney, Todd McMurtry, advised Chief Goodenough's counsel that he had not and would not file the charges with the Civil Service Commission and that, quote, "we will proceed without you," period, end quote. The refusal to submit this matter to the Civil Service Commission violates Villa Hills Ordinance 2010-6, Chapter 34.10 of Villa Hills Municipal Code, and KRS 95.761. Therefore, we move that this hearing be held before the Civil Service Commission as is proper pursuant to ordinance and law.
Yeah, we have called the hearing pursuant to KRS 95.765, which is the statute in Kentucky which governs hearings of police officers when a city has adopted a civil service ordinance. So I disagree with your opinion, and I think that KRS 95.765 is the statute by which we are to proceed. That's it.
Overrule your motion next one.
The next motion is Chapter 3401 of the Villa Hills Municipal Code establishes as required by KRS Section 65.003 a Code of Ethics. Pursuant to the Code of Ethics, Mayor Martin should recuse himself from deliberating and voting on the charges brought before Chief Goodenough due to his personal conflict of interest with the chief. Prior to being elected mayor, Mayor Martin was investigated by the Villa Hills Police Force, who then forwarded the case to the Kenton County prosecutor. The prosecutor charged Martin with second-degree forgery. Martin was arrested by the Villa Hills Police. After reopening the probate proceedings regarding his deceased mother's estate, the probate court ordered that the arrearage be sold and ultimately dismissed the charges. When the Kenton County District Court learned of the probate order, the forgery charges were dismissed. Then Mayor Martin sued Police Officer Goodenough in his personal and official capacity, bringing claims of false arrest and retaliatory and malicious prosecution. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky, the Honorable Judge Bertelsman, dismissed that complaint, that lawsuit. The U.S. District Court for the Sixth Circuit affirmed the dismissal of the lawsuit. They did determine that probable cause existed at the time for Martin's arrest. Mayor Martin holds a personal animosity towards the chief as evidenced by his litigation against Chief Goodenough. That animosity has continued through the present and culminated in the charges of removal now at hand. Thus, a personal conflict of interest, bias, and prejudice on the part of Martin exists. Pursuant to Villa Hills and Kentucky ethics, he should recuse himself from deliberating and voting in this hearing. Additionally, Martin's deliberation and participation in vote would violate Chief Goodenough's constitutional and statutory due process rights, mandating his recusal.
In response, I don't disagree that the mayor will not participate in the deliberations with the city council. I don't think under Kentucky law that Mr. Goodenough is entitled to a necessarily an impartial group of hearing officers because of the political nature being on mayor and council. As well, under Kentucky law, the chief is entitled to what is termed quasi de novo review after this, and will be afforded whatever rights he may wish to pursue in the Kenton Circuit Court. So, in my view, the law in Kentucky does not mandate the recusal of the mayor, especially in that he will not be deliberating with the council.
My understanding of the law is that he is not required to recuse himself. He's given the review in circuit court that's available should Chief Goodenough be aggrieved by these proceedings, then that can be taken up at that time. I will offer the mayor the opportunity to recuse himself, but given his presence here, I'm assuming you're not going to do that. Correct. Thanks.
We understand that the law firm of Sturgill Turner represents Mayor Martin in litigation pending against him by Joe Schutzman. Sturgill Turner also employs the hearing officer, Patsy Jacobs, who has been retained in this matter. Therefore, we request that an independent hearing officer be appointed to assure statutory due process rights of the chief and to avoid any conflict of interest.
Don't claim that the hearing officer has a conflict of interest. I don't think that the hearing officer has to have no conflict of interest. Normally, the mayor can preside as the hearing officer in this circumstance, so I don't see that there's any denial of due process in this case.
My understanding again is that an independent and impartial hearing officer is not required by statute or by the case law. I will state for the record that I have never heard of this case in any way, shape, or form until this morning when I was asked to hear it. So whatever actions Sturgill Turner Barker Maloney has taken in the past have not passed through me in any way, shape, or form. So, go ahead, Vicki.
And fourth and finally, pursuant to Kentucky state law, we have requested a public hearing, and we request confirmation that the vote on these charges be taken in public.
I don't know that, I think that under the Kentucky law that the deliberations of the city council are to be performed in closed session, that they do not have to vote publicly on these issues, but that they may return a verdict form just as a jury would, and I think that's what they're going to do. So I don't know that public deliberation certainly is not required, nor, in my view, the law is a public vote.
I think that's a little premature at this point. We'll take that up again when we get to it. That's all I'll say on that at this point. Any other procedural or preliminary matters?
None from the chief.
Do either side wish to make a brief opening statement?
I would like to Good evening, members of the council. As you know, I'm the city attorney, Todd McMurtry. I'm bringing these charges on behalf of the mayor as required by my role as a city attorney. And I just want to state, we've already heard preliminarily in the opening comments from opposing counsel the worn-out recitation of the prior dispute between the mayor and the chief. And I just want to say that the facts that will be presented today are all facts of things that have occurred in the very recent past, and that these are very fresh causes of action against the chief that will be described to you this evening, and none of which in any way relate to any of these prior issues described. In particular, The first cause of action that we'll ask you to consider is the conclusions in the report of the state auditor, Adam Edlin, which was submitted to the city on November 20th of 2014. We contend that the 3 of the 4 conclusions by the state auditor point to mismanagement by the police chief of his police force that resulted in some very significant expenses for the city. It was not until this report from the state auditor was submitted that, until after that point in time, that these charges were actually brought. The second issue relates to Executive Order 2010-001, and this is also a more current issue, or a very current issue, and that involves whether Chief Goodenough, pursuant to that executive order, properly supervised the city's then building inspector in his tasks. And there will be testimony from the city clerk, Craig Bowman, that the building inspector did not maintain adequate records. In fact, the building inspector didn't maintain records even at the city while under the chief's supervision, and the city had to engage in a lawsuit to get the building inspector to return what records he had. And so Mr. Bowman will testify that this person who was under the direct supervision of Mr. Goodenough in fact did not maintain records, did not maintain the records in an appropriate manner, and when he ultimately, after being compelled by a court, returned those records to the city, those records were inadequate and missing dozens or even over 100 particular items that should have been included in those records, and you'll hear Mr. Bowman testify on those issues. So again, that is a very current issue. Now, the one thing that you will hear that harkens back to the past a little bit relates to the mayor's directives to Mr. Goodenough to monitor and to limit the amount of overtime that was incurred through the department, and in particular through the detective and the building inspector at that time. In particular, you will see that the mayor directly asked the building inspector to, keep him informed on overtime and in his department and amongst the officers. And in fact, what happened instead was that one individual, the building inspector, was able to submit one overtime request for a 13-month period at one time, and that the normal procedure amongst the officers in the department at that time had been that they would submit their overtime every 2 weeks. Now, the reason that we're looking to the past somewhat is to support what's happening in the present, and that is that this significant overtime charge, as analyzed by the city clerk, in fact may lead to, well, first it led to an $86,000 payment of overtime for this person under the chief's supervision, and as well it may cause, due to recent legislation passed in the Commonwealth against spiking of public employee salaries, it may cause the city to incur an additional pension obligation for this one individual as high as $300,000, and you'll hear that from the clerk. And so, when we looked at some of these issues that occurred more than 3 or 4 months ago, we were going to look well back to the fact that the mayor repeatedly tried to get the chief to try to get Mr. Goodenough to report to him overtime. He failed to do that, and now the city may have, at least has had a $86,000 obligation, but may have a close to $400,000 obligation as a result of this lack of oversight. So we think the evidence will support, at the end of the day, will prove sufficient for you to find that Mr. Goodenough was inefficient, engaged in misconduct, and I don't mean to say that he necessarily did anything criminal or anything like that, but misconduct in the sense of didn't follow the mayor's directives, didn't comply with various city policies, that he was insubordinate to the mayor by not properly managing the the overtime issues, that there were violations of civil law as a result of these acts, and there will be evidence of that, violations of city policies, police department policies, and that together these are sufficient to warrant his removal from office. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Any opening on behalf of?
Sure. Council members, my name is Randy Creekman. I'm here on behalf of the chief. And we believe that this hearing is a totally unnecessary waste of city funds, and we believe that you should deny the mayor's request to remove Chief Goodenough. We believe the facts will not support what has been alleged against Chief Goodenough by the mayor and his attorney, and we believe that you will decide ultimately that none of the charges are legitimate enough to support removal of the chief. Let me give you some, in kind of summary fashion, the reasons why you should not remove Chief Goodenough. Number one, the charges are without merit, and that'll be demonstrated by the testimony of Chief Goodenough and also Mayor Martin. Secondly, the mayor has not followed the city's own policy regarding progressive discipline. And that's why you're going to hear a lot of evidence that's stale, meaning that the mayor and his council is going to try to convince you that things that happened in 2011, 2012, 2013, and that were not properly addressed should now be summarily result in the chief's discharge, when in fact the mayor failed in his own duties to discipline the chief if he thought it was necessary. In some ways, it's the pot calling the kettle black. He wants to talk about the chief mismanaging or failing his duties to supervise one or more employees, when in fact the mayor failed to discipline Chief Goodenough for the last 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden he wants to bring all of these charges in one form, rather than the traditional manner of giving an employee an opportunity to improve. If you have a problem with an employee's performance, be it with how they manage their workers, how they administer overtime, how they keep time records, talk to the employee. Don't sandbag them three years later after you've got a report from the Kentucky Auditor. The Kentucky Auditor's report was received in November, and the mayor still waited 3 or 4 months to bring these charges against the chief. And thirdly, the mayor has violated the city policy himself, once again, not only with respect to progressive discipline, but with respect to the policy of this city that says Chief Goodenough will be evaluated on an annual basis. And the purpose of an annual evaluation is to tell the chief, do we have a problem with your performance? Put him on notice, give an opportunity to correct his allegedly bad behavior. Mayor Martin has utterly failed in that regard. These policies come right out of the Vhdh employee personnel policy that Chief Goodenough operated under. It will be one of your exhibits. This seems very commonsensical, but because of the nature of these charges and the severe impact on Chief Goodenough, we are going to have to talk about it. And I frankly think this is a waste of taxpayer funds. But we're going to go through the process because the mayor's charges are without merit. The performance evaluation section. A performance evaluation, and talks about why you have a performance evaluation. It's supposed to put an employee on notice of any kind of performance problems. And one of the purposes of a performance evaluation is it may also be used as a factor in determining dismissal. Well, how are we going to use the annual performance review as a factor in this attempt to have him dismissed if we don't have a performance review? Ever since the mayor has been mayor, there has not been any personnel or performance evaluations of the chief, and this is in direct violation of your policy, and it's also in direct violation of his due process rights to have it be a factor in determining whether or not he's dismissed. Disciplinary action. The council also has a disciplinary procedure. Most important to this proceeding tonight is what this council has called the guiding principle for discipline. What is the guiding principle? Progressive discipline. If the chief, if the mayor had a problem with the chief related to his conduct in 2011 or 2012, he should have used your guiding principle of progressive discipline. The policy also states that progressive discipline normally goes from a verbal warning to a written warning to a suspension, and only after those steps do you consider dismissal, unless a single act is so egregious that it warrants discharge. So the mayor's failure to follow the city's own policy is grounds enough not to uphold these charges against the chief. The mayor has violated your policies against progressive discipline. There's also going to be some talk about alleged destruction of records. Although we're not going to see many of the records that the clerk actually retrieved, there's just going to be the allegation that some of these are missing. Well, what's interesting about that is that the mayor was reprimanded by this council on May 16, 2012 for the mayor's improper disposition of city property. Presumably, this relates to the destruction or burying of city property that occurred prior to May 16, 2012. Now, interestingly, you followed progressive discipline. He engaged in a arguably serious offense, destruction of property, and the chief was reprimanded. So in short, we think that these charges, that when you hear the evidence tonight, what you're going to hear is not only are the charges false, but also that to the extent that any of them have any merit whatsoever, that the mayor failed in his obligation to give Chief Goodenough progressive discipline, to put him on notice of performance deficiencies, give him an opportunity to improve if necessary, and he also failed to give him an annual performance review that is required by your own policies. Both of those failures are fatal to the city's case tonight. And we ask you to carefully deliberate later on, and we believe that you will vote, we would hope in a unanimous fashion, to deny the mayor's request to remove the chief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, council. Do you all have a copy of the charges? You've been provided that? Okay. Let me state that knowing that there is a history involved here with things that go back years apparently, I will state, and we will conduct the hearing as such, that according to Paris 59-765, subsection 1, the charges shall be considered as put in issue, and the trial will be confined to the matters related to the issue so presented. We will not spend the evening talking about things that are unrelated to the specific charges. So make sure everyone is aware of that, and I will admonish everyone as we go forward with that. With that being said, Mr. McMurray, would you call the first witness?
Yes, I'd like to call City Clerk Craig Bowman.
Where is it? Are there folks out in the hallway standing?
Phones on a cell phone.
Stand there. Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Have a seat, please. Could you state your name for the record?
Craig Bowman.
Go ahead, Mr. Bowman.
Mr. Bowman, good evening. As you know, I'm Todd McMurtry, I'm the city attorney of the city of Villa Hills. I'm going to ask you some questions, but first I'd like to just have you introduce yourself. The council knows you, but just for the record, please state your full name and your position and place of employment.
Craig Thomas Bowman. I work for the City of Villa Hills. I'm the city clerk.
And how long have you been the city clerk?
Just under a year.
What are, to your understanding, what are the general duties of the city clerk for Villa Hills?
To be the department head of administration, be the custodian of records, and to carry out the directives that are given to me by the mayor.
Great. I'm going to take you through that large binder that I handed you, and I provided a copy to opposing counsel, and I'll tell the city council that they will be able to take the witness's copy with them to the extent they need it in their deliberations. So it's a lot of paper there, so we just made the 3 copies. Mr. Bowman, if you would turn to the first tab of that document and tell me if you've seen that document before. I think it's right there on the top. It's in, let's see.
I have.
Okay. What is that document?
It is the charges against the chief.
Okay. And do you know when those were filed with the city?
They were filed last Wednesday.
Okay. Is that March 12th, 2014?
It is.
Okay. Now, with regard to, I guess my next question is, do you know the mayor, Michael Martin?
I do.
Okay. And do you know where he lives, which city?
I do. City of Villa Hills.
And do you know how long he's been the mayor?
Since 2011.
Now, do you know this gentleman seated to my left, who's served as the police chief for the city of Villa Hills?
I do.
And do you know how long roughly he served as police chief?
Police chief, just about 2 years.
And some of these questions are at points in time from before you worked for the city, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the employment records and documents that the city maintains with regard to the chief and other employees of the city?
Yes, as record custodian, I have personnel files, payroll records, and meeting minutes, and so I come across their names quite often. Now,
if you would, I think we have here, we'll go to tab 2. Well, let's stick with tab 1. With regard to tab 1, has that entire document been filed with the city of Villa Hills through your office?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And is it now part of the records of the city of Villa Hills?
They are.
Now, if you go to tab 2, tell me what that document is.
It is the rules and regulations of the police department.
For which city?
City of Villa Hills.
Okay. And do you know when those rules and regulations were adopted?
In 1993.
Okay. Was that pursuant to municipal order?
It was municipal order 2013-02, or 1993-02.
And are those police department rules and regulations a part of the records of the city of Villa Hills?
They are.
Now, if we could go to tab 3. Can you tell me what that document is?
This is the current City of Villa Hills personnel policies.
Okay. And were those personnel policies, have they been adopted by the city fully?
They have. They were fully adopted back in October.
And are those now part of the records of the city of Villa Hills?
They are.
Now, based upon your understanding of the personnel policies and the rules and regulations governing the police department, which you just identified, is Mr. Goodenough been subject to those policies in the city?
It's my understanding that's correct.
Now, if you would, I've marked, just for ease, the job description of the police chief is a part of tab 2, but it's also contained in tab 1C. And I'll tell you what document number it is here in a second. Oh, excuse me, it's in tab 1B.
1D.
1B, I'm sorry, 1B. That's just you see 1B there in front of you?
I do.
Can you tell me what those are? What 1B is, excuse me?
It is the job description of the police chief.
Now, that was attached to the original complaint, correct?
I believe so.
Now, is it also, to your knowledge, a part of the rules and regulations governing the police department of tab 2?
It is.
And based upon your knowledge of the rules and regulations of the police department, is Mr. Goodenough, as police chief, been responsible for fulfilling that job description listed there, both in Exhibit 1B and tab 2?
Yes.
Now, based upon your understanding of Mr. Goodenough's job description as police chief, did he have any responsibilities with regard to overseeing and approving timesheets submitted by members of the police department?
Yes, as department head, each of the department heads approve the timesheets for their department.
Objection, foundation.
Are those
There's
responsibilities?
nothing in 1D that relates to keeping timesheets.
With regard to the policies, what are the policies and procedures that the city of Villa Hills normally follows or has followed in your experience with regard to submission of payroll requests from police officers?
Objection, lack of foundation, no personal knowledge.
You get
Doesn't work in the police department, but he can go ahead and answer.
Well, first off, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna let him go ahead and answer. This is an administrative hearing, so go ahead.
Are you aware of any of the policies and procedures that relate to the police chief in Villa Hills' obligations with regard to monitoring payroll, monitoring the approval of timesheets of members of the police department?
As the city clerk, the payroll is run through my department, and my staff processes the payroll. And as a result, I have reviewed payroll records and documents since I've been employed as city clerk. And it has been a common practice that all of the timesheets are approved by each department supervisor before they are processed.
And have you reviewed timesheets for the period between December of 2011 through till, or November 2011 through till December 31, 2012?
I have seen those documents, yes.
And have you been able to discern from your review of those documents what the policies of the police department were with regard to submission of hours and payroll and so forth?
The payroll for the police department always came with an Excel spreadsheet that said approved by Dan Goodenough.
And how often did police officers during that period, based upon your review of those city records, submit their request for overtime?
With every pay period, every 2 weeks.
And based upon your review of those records, who was responsible for approving that overtime?
The overtime would be signed off on by the supervisor.
Now, during the time period that you served as city clerk, have there been police officers present during regularly scheduled city meetings?
Yes.
Okay. And why is that, to your knowledge?
That there is an executive order from the mayor that requires a police officer present at each meeting.
And prior to that executive order, were there police officers also present?
I believe so.
And do you know why those police officers were present?
Objection, foundation.
It's an administrative hearing.
You
I know, he's the clerk.
can answer, if you know.
Sure, according to the minutes of meetings that were held prior to my employment, it routinely shows that Chief Goodenough, who is police chief, would be present at these meetings. And also the building inspector, who was also a police officer.
Okay, now we talked earlier about tab 1, which is the findings of Adam Edelin. Have you reviewed those findings yourself? 1, it's the very first page.
Tab 1A.
The very first page. I'm sorry, 1A. Excuse me.
Yes, I reviewed this finding.
Okay. Now, what did you do to, or strike that, did you do anything to assist the auditor with that report?
As the custodian of record, the letter from the state auditor came to the city the second day I was employed, and it was my job to provide the payroll records, timesheets, and other documents that the state auditor's office requested.
And you say the second day that you were employed, do you recall that date?
It would have been April 17th,
Of what year?
2013.
And did you do that?
I did.
Now, I'm going to ask you if you've reviewed this portion of the record and then ask you some questions about it. Did you see the portion of the record that criticized the city for allowing its detective to receive a salary payable only due an assistant chief or lieutenant?
Yes, I did.
Are you aware from your review of the payroll records whether the detectives, who was then the detective of the city, whether that person was paid a salary other than that of the detective?
Yes.
Okay, and what was this person's salary? Who was the detective?
It was right at the top of the range for assistant chief.
And I asked you a bad question. I just want to be clear that the person who was the detective, are you testifying that that person was paid the salary of an assistant chief?
Yes.
Now, the report goes on to note that no personnel action was initiated to promote that detective to assistant chief. Are you familiar with that portion of the auditor's report?
I am.
And did you investigate that as a part of your gathering documents for the auditor?
Yes.
And did you discover whether or not that allegation was true or false?
I found no evidence of a promotion in the personnel records or the minutes of meetings.
Okay. Tell everyone here what process you went through to investigate that fact and present offers that statement that you just made.
There was some confusion within the city whether this individual employee was actually a detective or an assistant chief. So we reviewed, I reviewed the personnel file and found no record of a promotion to assistant chief in the personnel file. This individual had stated a date when that promotion was effective in 2004. Looked through the minutes of 2004, did not find any record of it in the minutes of the city record books. Then also knew that there had been some civil service ordinances passed at the end of 2010. Looked through the minute books at the end of 2010 and could not find a record of a promotion in the minute books either.
Did you find any evidence of an official promotion of this detective to the position of assistant chief?
I did not.
And again, did your review of the applicable employment and payroll records indicate that this detective was being paid at the level of an assistant chief?
That is correct.
Now, turning back to Exhibit 1B, on page 2 of 3 of the police chief's job description, do you see at section 1.13 that the police chief shall at all times remain informed himself of the affairs of the department and be assured that the duties of his subordinates are properly discharged?
Yes, I see that.
And is it your understanding that that is the obligation of the police chief of the city of Lower Hills?
Yes.
Okay. And was that true at all times from that to your knowledge, as the city clerk, was this particular job description and that requirement of section 1.13, has it been enforced the entire time that Michael Martin has been the mayor?
Records indicate that to be the case.
Now, the auditor had a second finding, and that was that there were discrepancies and duplication of hours worked as recorded on one employee's timesheets, overtime requests, and payroll records, and that made it impossible to determine the actual amount of time worked by this employee. Are you familiar with that allegation of the auditor, that conclusion of the auditor?
I am.
Okay. Did you assist the auditor in putting together this particular employee's payroll records?
Yes, per the request of the auditor's office, we received a letter specifically asking for timesheets and payroll records of a particular employee within a certain date range. And in the process of compiling those records, I noticed discrepancies between the payroll and the timesheets and noted them.
Were you able to determine the actual amount of time that this employee would have worked during that period that you just described?
No, I was not.
And can you explain why?
Well, there are several reasons. One is conflicting information within various timesheets that were provided. There are typically two sets of timesheets that are provided on each biweekly payroll, one an excess report produced by the chief, one a signed timesheet provided by the individual employee. Those did not always match. And then also there was an additional rather large pay request for 13 months of back overtime that was submitted at the end of 2011. And that document had differed from the hours worked for times that were submitted during the police department payroll that was submitted over that same 13-month time period.
Now, the auditor goes on to state, quote, that according to the police chief and administrative assistant to the police chief, hours worked and leave taken are recorded by each officer in the police department on a timesheet. Do you know from your own knowledge whether or not that is an accurate statement?
For the most part, I would say yes. According to the payroll records, prior to March of 2011, there were no signed timesheets from employees.
Now, at the end of a payroll period, the auditor goes on to state, I'm quoting, each officer enters their own time into a computerized system from which the police chief generates reports. Is that an accurate statement?
I believe so.
Is that accurate at the time period based upon the records that you reviewed, analyzed by the state auditors?
Yes.
Objection, again, lack of foundation.
Go ahead.
Within the payroll records held within the clerk's office, there are copies of both the access reports provided by the chief and signed timesheets provided by employees.
Now, the auditor goes on in his report to state that the auditor found several instances when conflicting information was recorded on the employee's timesheet so that the auditor could not determine whether the employee had overstated or understated his hours worked or incorrectly reported the hours worked. Are you familiar with that conclusion of the auditor's report?
I am.
And did the review that, the production of records that you undertook for the auditor support, in your view, that conclusion?
While I compiled the records for the state auditor, I noticed the same discrepancies.
Now, just to be clear, we're talking about a particular employee, and we've referred to somebody that was a detective who was being paid as an assistant chief, and somebody who was also a building inspector. Are those all the same person?
They are.
Okay. And with regard to the discrepancies that I just noted to the auditor's report, do those discrepancies relate to the same person?
They do.
Now, you mentioned before that the auditor noted that a particular employee submitted a payroll request, and maybe I have these dates wrong, from November 29th, 2010. Should that be December 29th, 2012 or 11?
No, the payroll request covered the very end of November of 2010.
Okay.
through the end of, through 12/29 of 2012, or 2011.
2011, okay. So I think I misstated that earlier. Did you understand that I was talking about, when I answered those earlier questions, I was asking you about the 13-month accumulated overtime request, or accumulated payment request?
The timesheets and the excess reports would have been similarly processed at that same time.
I'm sorry, did he say November of 2010 to December of 2011?
Yes.
Couple and a half years ago, 2.5 years ago?
And that particular overtime request was discussed in the auditor's report, correct?
Correct.
Now, if you would, let's turn to tab 6. And if you would, look at the entirety of tab 6, and when you've done that, I have some questions for you. Can you tell me what tab 6 is?
Tab 6 is the 13-month overtime pay request that was submitted by this employee and then submitted by Chief Goodenough the same day to the mayor.
And for how much money was this employee supposedly owed as a result of this 13-month request?
Approximately $73,000 in wages with retirement and FICA, that would be about $86,000.
Thank you. The auditor went on to state and recommended that the city should strengthen its internal controls for time reporting and payroll preparation to ensure work hours are properly reported and leave balances accurately reflected. Are you familiar with that recommendation of the auditor?
I am.
And has the city taken steps to implement that recommendation?
We've instituted a leave sheet that has to be submitted with all requests for paid time off. We've also pushed back the payroll date to give the administration department more time to process payroll and to have department heads address discrepancies.
Now, was there a particular reason that you pushed back that payroll date to give you additional time to note discrepancies?
Yes, it was very difficult to process payroll within a couple hours of having the department head provide the timesheets in the morning and then have it processed by 1 o'clock that same day.
Now, when you say that the department head, are you referring to anyone in particular?
Well, the department head would be both Chief Goodenough and Derek Yeldon, the Public Works Director.
So just to be clear, when was Chief Goodenough normally submitting his payment request to you prior to the implementation of the recommendations you just testified to?
Monday morning, the week that payroll is due.
And in your experience as clerk, in the time that you've been here, how has the chief performed in his responsibilities with regard to managing, tracking payroll of the police officers for the city?
I can say in my experience that we have not always received all of the signed timesheets from employees at the beginning of each pay period. I can say in my experience that we have noted that there are discrepancies between the written timesheets that were submitted and the excess reports that were provided by the chief. And I can also say that at times we are just simply missing timesheets.
And did all those instances in your experience relate to the chief's submission of timesheets?
Yes, the only department I have problems having the payroll process through for is the PD.
By PD, you mean the police
Police
department?
department.
Now, the auditor had another, and I'll quote from the audit report. It states that the chief stated that he reviewed the documentation. However, he noted there were times when the timesheets were submitted directly to the administrative assistant, or on occasion, he does not receive the timesheets until a few days after the end of the pay period, and therefore the process was not standardized or consistently followed to reconcile the original timesheets to the work hours entered into the database. Are you familiar with that statement in the auditor's report?
I am familiar with that statement.
In your experience and your dealings with Mr. Goodenough, is that an accurate statement by the auditor?
It is.
And it goes on, the auditor goes on to recommend that the city strengthen its review process of employee timesheets to ensure review is performed of all time reports and overtime requests before entering the information into the official payroll system for processing. Have you done that in the city?